Welcome to the Cuda Photography Podcast, a podcast about nature and wildlife photography in your own backyard and throughout the United States. Okay, welcome back to the podcast, episode 40, Using Flash in Nature Photography. Well, it's been a very boring month this month. I'm sorry to say that. We've had lots of snow in the Northeast. We've had lots of wind all along the eastern seaboard. And it's just been kind of cold and nasty. So I don't have a whole lot to say on what's going on in my world other than looking out my window and hoping for spring. But what this episode is about today is Flash. Flash is one of these topics that I think people like to ignore. I think people want to ignore it. I think people don't understand it. But Flash is not nearly as difficult as people, I think it is, first of all. And it's not that difficult even from a technical perspective. Yes, there are many advanced things you can do with flashes, but the bottom line is, for nature photography, we generally don't have extremely sophisticated setups. About the biggest setup we have is probably setup shots for hummingbirds and so forth. But other than that, it's usually a one flash setup, and it's really not that complicated. So hopefully, over the next two episodes, we're gonna iron this out. We're gonna explore it together, and I'm gonna kind of demystify flashes for you. And hopefully at the end of this, you'll not be afraid of it. You'll go out, you'll buy yourself a flash, and get busy. So first of all, and I've talked about this in the past in some of my other episodes, there's a lot of terminology thrown around when it comes to flashes. We hear the term flash, we hear the term strobe, we hear the term speedlight. Typically, when someone says flash, they're referring to the small on and off camera flashes that you'll find on most cameras. And typically this would be the built-in flash, for example, in your DSLR, the built-in flash in your point and shoot. These are all, typical flash setups, on-camera flash setups. But I think it's more than that. I think over time, the terms have kind of been separated out into very distinct categories. And I will oftentimes use the term flash interchangeably with strobe and speedlight. And I know that technically we're kind of separating those out now, and that's fine, I suppose. But I think you're okay if you use the term flash to describe any kind of flash, including strobes and speedlights and little tiny flashes on your iPhone or whatever. It's all flash. When someone says strobe, though, typically they're talking about large studio flashes. And these units, typically they're around 250, 500 watt seconds. They're usually have an external power source. Some have a large battery as an external power source. Some of them you plug into the wall, but they're made for studio work. I mean, yes, you can use them outdoors, absolutely, especially some of the more portable units that they make, where you can actually, plug your flash unit into a battery and so on. But that's what people mean when they say strobe. Now, again, the lines get muddled there. I've heard people talk about them, smaller flashes in terms of being a strobe. But that's usually what people mean. The speedlight, and I may be wrong about this, but I believe the speedlight is a term that was started by Nikon years ago. And it wasn't in vogue until, probably the last 10, 15 years. People before that, I think most people I talked to, most books I read, we use the term flash and strobe, and that was just the way it was. But when someone says speedlight, typically they're referring to the self-contained flashes that attach to your hot shoe on your DSLR or other types of cameras that have hot shoes. Mirrorless cameras, for example. Some of the point and shoots actually have hot shoes as well. But they come in various sizes. They're small. They're small speed lights that only throw a flash a short distance. There's large speed lights that shoot, many feet. So that's kind of the definition of a speed light. Although we as nature photographers can use strobes to do our work with, and I have seen this before on location shoots at waterfalls and things like this, typically we don't. Typically we're using the speed light. There are two types of speed lights, and here's more confusion. Speed lights come in two flavors. They come in a manual flavor, which is an all manual flash. Manual flashes have no way to determine the correct exposure. That's all has to be calculated by the user or the photographer. On the rear of the flash are usually a series of buttons to control the flash duration and the output. The higher the output, the longer the flash duration. The lower the output, the shorter the flash duration, and less power actually being emitted from the flash. Manual flashes are, in my mind, the best value out there. Typical examples of manual flashes would be the old tried and true Vivitar 285, the newer TT 560. There's some older flashes out there, many brands of flashes out there. Sunpack made some really good flashes back in the 90s. I would not buy a Sunpack flash now, however, but if you can find some on the used market, they're good. But they're all manual flashes, and yes, they had auto thyristors on them and stuff like that help to try to manage the exposure, but typically they were used as a manual flash. So the manual flash, like I said, it has a control on the back, and the control typically is measured in power output. And so you might see like half power and quarter power, 1/8 power, full power, and so on and so forth. And each one of those, obviously, the higher you turn it up, so if you're at full power, you're getting the maximum flash power that can give you. And, depending on the guide number and all that, and, we'll get into that in a little bit, it will depend. It will tell you how many feet that your flash can actually send out a blast of light. Manual flashes have some pros and cons. One of the pros is they're really easy to operate. They require no special cords or a link to the camera other than a hot shoe. They're also less expensive than the other flash, which is called a Ttl Flash, and we'll talk about that next. The cons, there's more trial and error. The photographer needs estimation skills. They need time to get their exposure set. That could be a problem for us, right? As wildlife photographers or nature photographers. It may take us, 5 or 6 seconds to dial in, maybe even longer than that, to dial in our correct exposure using the back of the flash. The subject may be gone by that time. And so, they typically take longer to set up. Now, as you become more skilled with a manual flash, you'll actually learn, in this scenario, my subject is 10 feet away. I need to shoot this at f8 at half power or whatever. So you'll get used to, and you'll know your flash over time. So that's the manual flash. The other type of flash that we see and is heavily utilized in today's world is what's called the Ttl Flash. Now, TTL simply stands for through the lens. And the reason it's called that is because that's the exposure system that it uses. TTL uses a series of quick infrared bursts that bounce off the subject, and they return back through the lens, And then that data is used along with your ambient exposure and other things to compute the flash duration and strength that the flash needs to pull off the exposure. Obviously, the biggest pro right away is you get very accurate exposures. There's less time needed for tweaking, and your subject is likely to not fly away or run away while you're doing this. Typically, they're made by higher end companies like Nikon and Canon, Quantum, various manufacturers make them. They also support something called high-speed sync. And we're going to talk more about flash synchronization in a little bit. But high-speed sync simply means that you can shoot your flash at shutter speeds higher than, 1/250th of a second, for example. You might be able to use a 1/500 or 1/1000, depending on what your flash supports. And that can be very handy as wildlife photographers when we're in a situation where there's a lot of ambient light. So, that's definitely a pro. Now, the cons, well, they require special cords to use off camera to use the TTL portion. They have more costly triggering systems, wireless triggering systems. We'll talk about that later. Some examples of TTL flashes. The Yongnuo YN685 runs you about $100. Probably the most inexpensive and well thought of third-party TTL flash. And then you can go to the other extreme, which is the Canon 600EX, which will cost you about $400. But it has all the bells and whistles. It's guaranteed to work with your camera and so on. So that's the two types of speed lights, if you will. What do I recommend? I recommend both, but currently I am using a manual flash system. It works for most of my needs. They're inexpensive. They're easy to operate. If you break one, you can replace it for $35. And, it's a good economical way to get into flash photography. However, understand that the TTL does, again, have those advantages of high-speed flash sync. The ability to work better with your camera system. I mean, that's an important concept and an important feature. But I do recommend that if you're on a budget, that you stick with the manual flash, and you will not be disappointed. And hopefully, as we explore the flash systems more over the next couple episodes, that you'll get a better feel and hopefully be much less fearful of using your flash. Okay, so let's talk first in depth about the manual flash. Now, I have two manual flashes here in front of me. I have an older manual flash that was created back in probably the 90s. I'm not sure exactly when this flash was created. It's a very small flash. It's called the Sunpack Auto 222. This was back when Sunpack made some rather decent flashes. I've got another Sunpack flash here called the Sunpack Auto 383 Super, which is a very good old manual flash, also made in the 1990s. And I've actually got another flash here that I forgot to mention, which is the TT520, which is a newer TT520, Neewer. Some people say newer. And it's an all-manual flash. Now, a couple things you're going to run into first and foremost with these flash units. If I were to look at, say, my Sunpack 383 Super, there's a couple things about this. Back before TTL was popular, the flash units, the manual flash units, also had what's called an auto thyristor. And basically how this worked was, there's a little eye on the front, or a little sensor, if you will, on the front of your flash. And when your flash fires, it sends out a beam of light. That flash sends out its light. And at the time it takes to get back to that sensor, it knows to cut off your flash at that exact moment. That is how it knows to control your exposure. Now, it wasn't nearly as sophisticated or nearly as reliable, of course, as the modern TTL systems. But in a pinch, it was better than manual. So many of these old flash systems you will see still have these. And you can pick these up on the used market for very inexpensively as well. This particular flash, as I was saying before, when it is in manual mode, you can actually see on the back there is various power settings. I have 1/16 power, 1/8 power, 1/4 power, 1/2 power, and full power. And depending on your flash's guide number and so forth, those various strengths will give you various distances that your flash will be effective at. So I probably need to stop and talk just a little bit here. I don't want to get too far off in this rabbit trail, but probably need to talk about the inverse square law. Okay, now don't get frightened. Don't start having flashbacks of your physics class in high school. Thank God that those days are over. Forget the physics. Forget the formula that's used with the squaring of this and squaring of that. Forget all that. Simply stated, the light your flash produces will lose intensity in a predictable pattern based on the distance it has to travel. So in other words, light will get dimmer as it travels from the source to its target. You know, we know this. This is not rocket science, okay? It is physics. It is measurable. But we know this, okay? And so when I fire my flash, it's not going to keep that same intensity as it leaves the flash head. What happens is it will start to spread out. That light over greater distances will spread out more and more and more and more until it is no longer. That's just the way flashes work. That's the way speedlights work. That's the way strobes work. Studio strobes. So in short, you can kind of think of this as, you know, if I have somebody close to my flash, let's say I have a bear. I don't recommend taking pictures of bears with a flash, but let's just keep going with this example. If I have a bear close to my flash and I fire it with the correct exposure, he'll come out fine. As I back up or the bear moves away and I continue to shoot with that same exposure, that same flash intensity, that same power setting on the back of my flash, the bear gets more and more underexposed because the flash is spreading out and it's losing that intensity. That's simply what the inverse square law does. Yes, it's more technical. Yes, you can get into the whole, go out to Wikipedia, check out the formulas. You can figure it all out on your own if you would like. So you have to understand that concept. The light is going to fall off rapidly in a predictable manner. So that's a basic flash that was made in the 1990s. Now, if I move over to the TT520 or any of the TT series, the TT, what is it now? The TT560, I believe. Any of those, all manual flashes. By the way, this is a flash that I recommend, which is any of the newer TT series. So TT520s, TT560s, and there's another one in there too I'm missing. Might be the TT550. Any of those flashes are fine. They'll provide you with more than enough light to get the job done. But on the back, as I look at this flash and I turn it on, at the bottom there's a plus and a minus button. And that's really all these things do. Yes, there's different modes you can put it into. This particular one has an optical trigger system on it, so that, we'll talk about that later. But for now, just realize there's a minus and a plus button on the back of your flash. And as I click the plus button, the flash power increases, and so does my flash intensity. And also the length of the flash duration increases. As I decrease, as I press the minus button, my flash duration shortens, and the intensity is less. So what does that mean? Well, simply put, if I were to increase this to full power, I might be able to stand back, 15 feet without any issues. However, if I take it down to its lowest setting, then my flash head might have to be within a foot of my subject. So you can see how that affects your proximity to your subject. Now, there's also the idea that, well, let's not get into that right now. That's for later. Just realize right now that the manual flash, the more power you give it, the farther it'll throw. So I cannot freeze action as well on those high power settings, or as well as I can on the lower power settings, or the shorter flash durations. So that's the manual flash. Now I happen to actually have a TTL flash here. It's a really, really old one. I don't use a lot of TTL anymore. This went with a Canon film camera. It's called the Speedlight 160E. And this is an example of a very compact flash with very little power. It was designed basically for cameras that did not have pop-up flashes. So it would be roughly the equivalent of your pop-up flash that exists on your camera currently. And by the way, that pop-up flash is a TTL flash. I'm not going to get into TTL flashes a lot simply because I don't use them enough to be an expert on them, and I don't use them enough to give you the best guidance in the world. I will just simply say that they work. They give you an exposure which would be used to properly illuminate your subject. Now, is it the best quality of light? Maybe not. You might have that really flash appearance where most of your subject is perfectly illuminated, but the background is dark, depending on your ambient light. So you still have to adjust. I don't want to make it sound like you don't have to adjust your exposure on a TTL system. TTL systems still need compensation, plus and minus compensation. But they're just a whole lot easier to use in general. Having said that, again, if you learn a manual flash, then you'll have no problems understanding a TTL flash. As a matter of fact, if you learn the manual flash and you learn it well enough, you probably will never even switch to the TTL system. I mean, there really wouldn't be any need other than taking advantage of high-speed sync and so on. Okay. So that's, how they look, how they feel. How do they attach to your camera? It's very simple. And I know this is rudimentary, and I apologize if you are too advanced for this. But on the top of your camera is something called a hot shoe. And a hot shoe is just an interface where your flash attaches to your camera and allows an interface to where when you depress your shutter button on your camera, it sends a signal to your flash to tell it to fire. That's all the hot shoe does. Yes, there are smarter hot shoes nowadays that you can do various communication with your DSLR. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm just talking about that simple impulse to fire your flash. It just slides right into the mount, to the hot shoe. You screw it in place, and you're done. Okay, that's basic flash setup. Now, let's talk about how your camera communicates with the flash. Now, with a TTL system, that's going to be much more advanced. Let's just talk about the manual flash. Okay, I'm gonna take my manual flash here. I'm gonna mount it on my Canon 7D. It's quick and easy to mount. I'm gonna turn on my camera. It's already on. And I'm gonna notice right away that I see that I'm at 1/400th of a second. Now, your camera will have what's called a sync speed, a flash sync speed. And you can read in your manual to find out what it is. My 7D is a 2/50th. My 1D Mark III is a 300th of a second. And if you do not abide by setting your camera's shutter speed at that sync speed when using a manual flash, you will incur problems. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set it to 2/50th of a second. Now, what would happen if I set it a 500th of a second? Well, depending on the power setting on the back of your flash, you may wind up with a black bar running across your image. Because what's happened is the flash, when it fires, if it's not in sync with your shutter, your flash will actually catch the shutter while it's opening or closing. And that will create a black bar across your image. That's not desirable, right? Now, the other thing you might run into is if you're using a shorter flash duration. I've done this experiment before. If you crank your flash duration or your flash power all the way down, crank up your shutter speed to like 1/500th of a second, and fire it, you won't see the black bar. But what you will oftentimes see is a darkening of your image and a part of it, just a slightly darker part of your image. Or you won't see the flash work hardly at all, because it's just, you're still having some interference with your shutter, is what I'm trying to say. So please do not try using a shutter speed longer than what your camera manufacturer recommends. Or I mean, shorter than what your camera manufacturer recommends. It will not work, and you will be a very unhappy photographer. Once I have it set, I have my flash on, I have my sync speed or my shutter speed set to my sync speed, I can fire the flash. And typically what you would do with a manual flash in today's world, in the old days, you would need to memorize the distances between the subject and your camera. Well, we don't really have to do that anymore. Now we fire a picture, we look at our LCD, and we say, oh, it's overexposed. Okay, let's turn the flash down. Try to turn it down a step or two. Fire it again. It's perfect. Or maybe it's a little underexposed, so turn it up one step. So that's how we use a manual flash these days. Very different than we used it 20 years ago. Back when I was doing film, manual flashes were really tricky, and you had to actually know the distance from your film plane to your subject, and then you had to do the calculations manually, unless you had an auto thyristor, which I just talked about. So I know it's getting complicated here, but you can see where I'm going with this. I've talked about the two types of flashes. I've talked about the pros and cons of those two types of flashes. And I've talked about how to mount the flash on your camera. The next thing I want to talk about, and this is going to be the last thing we're going to talk about today. Next time we're going to talk more in depth, but this is kind of a cursory beginner's feel for flash photography. I want to talk about the accessories that you use to hold your flash. I just talked about one, which is the top of your camera. There are actually several other options available, and you're going to, throughout your wildlife photography quote career, you're going to use a variety of these mechanisms. Trust me, you will try them out and you will find the ones you like, and you will probably not use, most likely you will not use the hot shoe on top of your camera. All right. First, I want to talk about the bracket. Many years ago, not many years ago, but 20 years ago, 2 decades ago, we typically used what's called a flash bracket to do weddings and any kind of photojournalistic endeavors where you needed a flash quickly and you needed a bracket. Now, why would you ever need a bracket? First of all, what is a bracket? A bracket is this frame that your camera actually screws into, and it actually sits your flash, primarily the bracket I'm talking about, which is a Strobo Frame bracket typically used for weddings and so forth, will actually has this metal C that will, it kind of it raises your flash above your camera. Now, why does it do that? Why? You've seen these before, I'm sure. Why would you want to get your flash above the camera? I'm getting kind of out of the scope of this first part 1 of this series. But realize that if you do not get your flash above the camera, you will suffer from red eye. Your subjects will have red eye, or blue eye, or steely eye, whatever you want to call it in animals. This is not desirable, trust me. And if you can avoid it, do so. You don't want to have to remove it in post. So what I do is I use what's called a Strobo Frame. And I think what I'll do is, because this is fairly complex subjects, I'm going to post a lot of links probably in the show notes and kind of show you, what I'm talking about here. So that's one method. The other method is there are C clamps or C frames or whatever you want to call them, where they attach in a similar way to the Strobo Frame. But the idea is still the same. You're getting that flash above the camera. There are also various arms, flash arms, that will, they're basically bars with joints in them that you can position your flash, or sometimes they have a gooseneck type of setup where you can actually position the flash any way you would like to around your subject, and still be attached to your tripod or your camera. But the point is always the same. You're trying to get that flash sometimes off axis and sometimes on axis, but always higher than your camera to avoid red eye. So that's the first thing. And I kind of got into technique there. I didn't really want to, but I wanted to talk about that right off the bat. Is if you really want to be successful, get your flash off your hot shoe. That's the first thing. Sometimes I use my hot shoe when I have to. Look, if you have to, you have to. Maybe you're on location somewhere and you don't have your Strobo Frame, or you don't have your various brackets. You got to put it on the hot shoe. Go ahead. Absolutely. But do consider not using the hot shoe. Get that flash above the camera. And that's really all I had for part 1 of this episode. Part 2, we're going to talk more about sync speed. We're going to talk about wireless flash triggers. We're going to talk about scenarios that you would get into where you would need flash, and then how you would appropriately use that flash. I mean, we may go 3 episodes here. I think I can fit it into 2, but we may very well go 3 episodes. But anyway, that's all I have for today. Thanks for listening. Make it a great day, and get out there and enjoy nature. Bye-bye. Music for this episode was provided by Dr. Turtle.